Hi there, welcome to Flaming Star Podfics. Today we are continuing Axiom of Choice by Literally Mad Lad on AO3. This is Chapter 6, Oh, to be a Merman Among Barflies. Katsuki's new legs were functional, if not awkward, to stand on. It took several hours for him to stand on two legs the way Deku always did. Straight-backed, poised, his feet slightly parted. The balancing act was precarious at best. Using the wall for support, Katsuki taught himself how to walk. He had observed Deku and the assistant thousands of times before, and each step mimicked the way they walked. It was jerky and uncomfortable at first, but with practice, his steps became smooth and even. His first steps away from the wall were nerve-wracking. It felt like he was suspended above a great height, and to see his home from this vantage point was bizarre. This is what Deku sees, Katsuki thought. He tried the stairs. They creaked underneath the soles of his feet. When he approached the door, he gave the handle an experimental tug, but it was locked. Even if he wanted to leave, he couldn't. Katsuki sat on the stairs, his new legs stretched out ahead of him. He ran his hands over his kneecaps, which were flushed and bony underneath his thumbs. Ages ago, Katsuki had asked why Deku couldn't spend more time in the water. He had explained once to Katsuki that humans couldn't live in water for long periods of time, otherwise their skin became pruny. The water would wash away sebum, which would allow his skin to become waterlogged. The more Katsuki ran his hands up and down his torso, the more the texture started to mimic his new legs. He was losing the glossy film over his skin that protected it from the water. He couldn't breathe underwater, and while he knew he could still manage to hunt, it would be difficult with his clumsy, grotesque human legs. Katsuki approached the dock once more and dove off of the end. He pierced through the water, his hands stretching out to grab the fabric at the bottom of the pool where his makeshift den was. He pulled them up with him, his breath pinched in his chest. He gasped for air on the surface as he slapped the clothes onto the dock to dry. Once the clothes were dry, Katsuki tugged them on. He had worn Deku's shirts before, and this one was worn down from the water. It was thin and wrinkled, and the pattern that used to be on it had dissolved weeks ago. The swim trunks were uncomfortable, but if Deku always wore them, then Katsuki would too. And then Katsuki crossed the dam. The levee system they used for the dam wall involved a series of ropes and chains, strung up by wheels attached to the ceiling. One such wheel was close to the river waterfall entrance. Katsuki gave the levee chain an experimental tug. The metal was grimy with some black oily substance, which Katsuki brushed off on his swim trunks with a disgusted sneer. He went for the rope levee on the opposite side of the dam and detached it from the wheel. He looped the end of it, knotted it, and added a second loop slightly higher up, and then another, until he couldn't reach. Part of the rope was submerged in the water. Katsuki gave it a firm tug, but the moment he hooked a foot through the rope swung far from the waterfall tunnel. His knees wobbled, unsteady, and he screamed the instant his foot dropped out from the rope. The rope split the skin underneath his toes and seared his palms as he skidded down and dropped into the salty water. So much for keeping the clothes dry, he thought as he ran his hands over the underside of his feet. The cut was pretty drastic, all things considered, and upon trying again, it only made the cuts worse. He floated on the surface after several failed attempts and reconsidered his options. He could slowly starve to death. He could scale the stone wall. One look at the rock underneath the tunnel, and Katsuki was certain he'd be sustaining more than just a cut on the bottom of his feet. He groaned, slapping his arms into the water. He had mapped the cave system better than the back of his own hand. Several kids in the past had investigated every crevice outside of the water, too, with no avail. There was no way out of here except Deku's door. Katsuki took a deep breath of crisp, cool autumn air and breathed it out. He did so until his heart rate returned to normal. It was then that a memory surfaced. He blinked, staring at the ceiling. The water had lapped up around his cheeks, but it spilled away the instant he straightened. He swam to one corner of the containment pool, the very crevice he used to lie in during the few times Deku and the assistant had cleaned the pool. The same crevice with the gap in the very back of it. too narrow for the meat of his tail to fit through on that first day of his freedom. Katsuki took a deep breath and ducked down. He kicked and thrashed his feet out, arms pumping him towards the bottom of the cave. His hand grazed the rocks, and he hooked them over and propelled himself forward. His chest felt like a goddamn rock, and the sensation only grew the longer he spent under the surface, reaching through the crevice. His hand dipped through, and then his shoulders, and his hips weaseled through shortly thereafter. The rocks were frigid as he scraped past them. His knees clunked and clanked through the gap before the tops of his feet scraped along the surface. Katsuki dragged himself forward by his arms. He gripped hold of the ledges on the rock, squeezing his shoulders through the narrow passage before heaving the rest of his body after. Whatever remaining function he might have had in his gills seemed to be the miracle keeping his lungs from collapsing. He maneuvered up to a slightly larger opening between a collapsed rock and a patch of solid clay. By then, his lungs were screaming, but his stubbornness refuted it. He wouldn't turn back. Not now. An unintentional groan of discomfort squeezed out of him as he crawled between the solid blocks of clay. His foot shoved against the rock behind him, clawing for purchase. That groan, though, sacrificed any remaining air he had in his reserve. His hands floundered forward into nothing. Something crashed into it with the force of a current. The river! Katsuki gasped out, choking. His lungs spasmed with the lurch in his chest as his hips became snared by the clay. The heels of his palms dug into the clay, sinking. His face broke the surface, but his lungs were too waterlogged to gasp for air. With a choked cough, the current surged over him, splashing in a haze of white-tipped waves. The crash of waves ripped him forward. His hips popped out from between the clay rocks. The second he broke the surface completely, it was pandemonium. Shit, shit, shit! He grappled for the nearest rock, but as he did, his legs swung out to the side, useless against the current. His hand slipped, dragging across the mossy surface until a splash of water knocked over him and sent him spiraling away from the edge of the river. He coughed, and all of the water he swallowed ripped up his esophagus. His stomach crashed into something solid, knocking out whatever air he managed to recover. His legs swung under it, and the moment he grabbed hold, he recognized it as a rotting tree branch. The bark was slimy with moss and moisture, but he held on. The water barreled over him, knocking his head under. Katsuki clawed up the branch, his feet skimming the weeds on the bottom of the riverbed as he went. The branch jerked forward as the bottom half cracked under his weight. He needed to move fast, and the minute the dread crossed his mind, he was already digging his non-existent nails into the dirt. He heaved himself onto the grass, coughing water up as he panted. His legs struggled to catch on, and it took the last remaining upper body strength he had to drag his knees up into the grass. He curled his feet up, shuddering as another cough wrecked through him. Several minutes went by. Katsuki was shaking by the end of it. The breeze split through his skin like needles into his bones. He sat up, chest on fire, and rubbed his hands across his face to clear his vision. There was no telling how long or how far he had been carried down the stream. He couldn't recognize anything more than the stars overhead, which were graying out closer to the horizon. There was still a dusting of sunlight on the horizon, but Katsuki couldn't be certain if it was sun or light pollution. The trees behind him loomed, and the hill ahead of him seemed manageable enough. He could hear something beyond it, something rattling like the metal door in the cave. Katsuki pushed to his knees, stumbling, and took 2 tries to stand with his hands pushing against the grass. He half crawled up the hill, using the river rocks as footing for his ascent. The pebbles trickled down behind him before at last coming to a stop when he reached his vantage point. From there, he could make out the shape of a distant road, and before that, a beam of light splitting across the trees. A deafening horn rattled Katsuki's sensitive eardrums. He winced, pressing a hand to his ear as the metal rattling came close. So close, in fact, that Katsuki could feel it resonating in the ground. It shook up the bones of his new legs and nearly sent him tumbling back into the river. He caught himself dropping onto his bum as he watched the beam of light split past him at the head of a fast-moving line of metal freights. Katsuki covered his ears, but he could feel the vibrations in his jaw as he clenched his teeth and tried to drown out the sound. The gusts of wind from the blur of metal nearly knocked him over again when he stood up. Even through the muffling of his hands, he could catch the sound of a distinct word. Kid! Hey, kid! Kotsky startled at the sudden vice around his arm, hauling him back. His hand was ripped from his ear, and the muffling popped into a cacophony of noise. He barely managed to sneer at the face of a complete stranger before the guy was saying, Kid, the hell are you doing so close to the tracks? Kotsky's immediate reaction was to hiss at him, but caught himself mid-snarl. He shook his head, half shrugging, like Deku did when the assistant used to ask him questions he didn't know the answer to. The man was far taller and far older than Kotsky and looked like he was overdue for a checkup at the doctor's. His gaunt expression made his eyes eerily hooded under his heavy brow, which was pulled in, tight with concern. His eyes dropped down to Kotsky's bare feet and the state of his ratty clothes. The man dropped his hands from Kotsky's shoulder and looked around, like he was expecting someone else to come out of nowhere. Kotsky looked as well, considering he hadn't seen or heard the man before the guy shocked his adrenaline into overdrive. You with anyone, kid? The man asked, and Kotsky just stared at him. The man sighed, narrow shoulders slumping. His head looked too big for his scrawny body. You heading anywhere in particular? Back into town? It became clear that Kotsky had no intention of talking, but he had no intention of walking either. The train was still barreling past. The end wasn't in sight yet. Well, the man huffed, hobbling back to where he had haphazardly dropped his things near the river. I'll wait with you here until we could cross, all right? I was just on my way back when the train came in. Bit inconvenient. The box on the ground started to rattle as the man tipped it onto its flat bottom and began plucking shiny objects out of the grass. Kotsky stepped closer until the man said, Careful. Dropped a couple of hooks. Don't want you to step on them. Kotsky crouched down close to the ground. His eyes were still adjusting to the dark as the sun faded away, so he could only feel for the hooks in the grass. Even the man brought out a flashlight. Kotsky nabbed one that had a shiny, colorful, oval attachment on it, and the man took it and dropped it in the box. You ever fish? The man asked. Kotsky figured he meant fishing in the sense that the intruders used to fish, so he shook his head. No, I haven't, Kotsky said, voice rough. I'm a big fly fisher guy myself, the man said. The rapids back that way aren't very conducive for it. The man rambled nonsensically over things Kotsky didn't particularly care about. It had been so long since he heard another person's voice that he was more enthralled by the intonations of his voice. He would pause now and again to clear his throat violently or cough off to the side. It sounded like his lungs were caving in with some nameless fluid that rattled with each cough. Kotsky didn't ask about it and pretended to ignore it when it happened. When the tracks cleared, the old man started forward, the box under one arm and a fishing pole in his other hand. Kotsky followed after him. They were both rather slow to cross, Kotsky because his feet weren't quite prepared to handle the railroad tracks, and the old man because he was old. Kotsky helped carry the box after a time. The walk to the old man's car was quiet, all except for just about everything in the wilderness, from the river to the trees to the grass under their feet, to the old man's labored breath. The man's truck was parked in an otherwise abandoned lot surrounded by trees. He dropped the back door down so Kotsky could slide the box up onto the bed of the truck for him. The fishing pole went in after. Afterwards, Kotsky stood back and stared as the man took a few tentative steps around the truck and stopped multiple times to look back at Kotsky. Do you need a ride, kid? The man asked, gesturing to the truck. Kotsky blinked. The man sighed. Tell you what, kid, get in the passenger seat and I'll take you into town. It'll be too much of a hike for you without your shoes. With that, the man pulled open a side door on the truck and climbed inside. He reached a hand out of the window to gesture for Kotsky to get in the opposite side. Kotsky had only seen cars from afar, and the time Deku and the assistant transported him from the facility to the cave didn't count. He approached, hesitant, and the semi-tinted windows were too dark now for him to see whether or not the old man was watching him. Kotsky opened the door and pushed himself up. The seat was high off the ground, and he used the step to give himself a boost. The door itself was heavier than expected, and it took 2 hands to swing it back into place. Before the truck could move, the old man stretched out a strap from the wall and crossed it over his own chest. It clicked into place on a little red box, and the old man said, "Safety first." Katsuki looked for one on his side. It squealed as he dragged it out of the wall, extending it as far as he could before bringing it back to search for a place to lock it against the cushion. The moment the truck was in motion, Katsuki was transfixed. The brightest artificial light he had ever seen outside of the facility came on with a twist of a stick jutting out from the side of the truck's steering wheel. All of the trees came to life in blips as the truck picked up speed. Katsuki was on the edge of his seat until his head grew dizzy from trying to follow the lines on the road. He leaned his head against the cool window and yawned, but his exhaustion would only last him as long as it took to reach the glow off in the distance, dispersed among the houses and buildings and trees. There were hundreds of them, and they consolidated on the very street the old man drove Katsuki down before coming to a slow resting spot next to a brick building. There were cars outside of the building, all of the same make and shape, with black hoods and trunks and a white body. There were details printed on the side that Katsuki couldn't read. He looked to the old man, who said, "You want to go in?" "What?" Katsuki said. "To the police station." I don't... He didn't know what that was, but he heard of police before and the peril that might have brought Deku back at the cave. All of Deku's concerns surrounding the invader had to do with the police. He shook his head. "No police," he said softly. But he couldn't help the defensive way he tensed, like he was about to fight this old man right then and there to get away from the police station. The old man raised his hands in surrender. Okay, we don't have to go in. You got an address, kid?" Katsuki shook his head. The old man sighed. He put a hand to his chin and rubbed it up along the side of his face. It settled there as he pondered, frowning at the wheel. After a tense moment, he clicked his tongue. "Right. Well, I've got a spare room. You could stay there till I figure out a better arrangement." Katsuki said nothing, but a decision had been made, so the truck started to move again. Katsuki watched the police station drift off behind them, through the side mirror where things appear bigger than they are. Their next stop was in a lot full of cars outside of a building with a glass front and a bright glowing sign. Katsuki's chest hummed from the music inside, and when the old man got out, Katsuki did too. The bright pink and blue lights were glaring against Katsuki's sensitive eyes, and he could see people underneath stained glass, tungsten chandeliers inside. Katsuki was still staring, processing, when the old man passed by him on his way to the door. "You comin'?" the man said. "We're going in there?" Katsuki thought, and decided that this was just as nerve-wracking as the day Deku and the assistant pushed a cart into his facility room and told him to get in. He jogged forward, heart buzzing, and reached a hand out to meet the door as the old man swung it open. The muffled music came forward with a burst of color and light, and the low rumble of voices swarmed him. He stared wide-eyed at the scene until he nearly lost track of the old man. The guy was walking straight up to where a woman was posted behind a countertop lined with stools, some occupied, others empty. "Yagi!" she cheered, voice larger than life. She slapped a hand on the counter and the other on her hip. "Thought you were coming back half an hour ago. Folks have been asking about you." "I got caught up by the train," he said. His voice, Katsuki realized now, was feeble in comparison. Katsuki's was even more so in light of this woman, who had glanced at him once and then again when she realized that Katsuki was lingering because he was with the old man. The old man, Yagi it seemed, rubbed a hand against the back of his neck before gesturing to Katsuki and saying, "And I found this kid out by the rapids." "What the hell does that mean?" she laughed, eyeing Katsuki up and down. She paused, blinked, and leaned over the counter to look down at his bare feet. "Did you fish him out?" someone asked just a few stools down. Yagi laughed and denied it. The woman leaned across the bar, her smile bright against her dark caramel cheeks. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Katsuki glanced at Yagi and then the stranger down the bar and said nothing. "That's okay. You keep it to yourself," she said. "My name's Mitsuki, and the youthful, ageless gentleman who brought you in—" "Enough of that," the old man groaned. "Is the owner of this here establishment. You want something to drink?" Katsuki nodded, and she encouraged him to sit at the bar. He shook the nearest stool, eyeing the stranger down the line as he did. Shortly thereafter, Mitsuki took the old man behind the bar and dragged him down the line to grab a glass at the far end of the bar. They stayed there an awful long time, talking quietly amongst themselves, which didn't work very well considering Mitsuki had a voice that rivaled the train on the tracks. He caught the stranger's eye. The stranger took a long, slow sip of his drink, maintaining dull eye contact. "You from around here or what?" the guy asked. Katsuki shrugged. The man snorted a laugh. "It's a yes or no question, kid. You either are or you ain't." "Oi, stop harassing the kid," Mitsuki shouted, waving her arms about as she circled back. In her hand was a glass filled to the brim with a bright red substance. It reminded Katsuki of fresh blood in the water before it went dark. She slid it over to him and stuck a thin tube in it. The clear tube reminded Katsuki of the IV drips from the facility, so he plucked it out and set it on the counter. He put his lips to the edge of the glass and took an experimental sip. It was nothing like he had ever tasted before, and it sent his taste buds surging into overdrive. His tongue stung for a moment, but the numbness didn't last before he was diving back in. "Listen, kid," Mitsuki said, "Yagi's place is a pigsty." "Is not," the old man muttered. The stranger howled with laughter. "My place has even seen better days." "You'll be bumming at mine, got it?" Mitsuki said. "And first thing tomorrow, we're getting you some shoes." Katsuki didn't care. He just wanted more of whatever this sickly sweet substance was. And that's it for Chapter 6 of Axiom of Choice. I hope you are enjoying the story so far. If you are, please go over to AO3 and let the author know that. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on future chapters. Chapter 7 will be out soon. Thanks for listening.